Today I'm going to try out two different types of seam guides that you attach to your machine. These are the ones I normally use, Sewing Edge. The price up there says $14.99, and that's in Canadian. And the others are this 6-pack of guidelines for quilting. So first off, the differences seem to be that these ones are twice as long as these. There's 5 in a pack of these ones and 6 in a pack of these. So I'm going to open them. So these purple ones just peel off, and they're like a clear plastic, and you can reposition them and use them over and over again until they eventually lose their stickiness. The one I have on my machine right now, it's cut short because as the ends get kind of worn and bits of lint get stuck to them, I just chop the bit that's worn off the end, and then you can keep on using it. So a pack like this often lasts me as many months, so 5 months worth. These ones I've not used. So they do give you instructions on the back on how to figure out what your seam allowance should be. I actually have a pretty good machine and I use the edge of the foot because my 1/4" foot is pretty accurate. But you can test it if you like. So they suggest on here to use a prep tool, which is something that doesn't actually come in the packet, which is interesting, to be able to mark on where your seam allowance should be. So since we haven't got one of those, what you could do is just put a piece of scrap fabric underneath and sew a seam with your machine, and then just kind of figure out where that lines up. So these are more flexible, they're not as hard wearing as the purple ones, so they don't feel quite as sticky either. We'll try them out on the machine. So as I mentioned, on my machine I actually have just a little bit of that purple one left, so I'm ready to replace that. I do have marks on here about where my 1/4" seam is, but if you want a scant one, that's where you need to do a test. So if I just use this scrap as a guide. I'm going to position it where I think the 1/4" is, where the mark is on the machine. And then I'm going to use a quilting ruler just to see how accurate that is. So if I put the seam line right on the 1/4" guide there on this ruler, the edge of the fabric is right up against that edge, so you know that that's pretty accurate for a 1/4" seam. If you want a scant one though, you're probably going to either want to move your needle across a position, which I can't do on my machine, or sew a little closer to the needle. So with that in mind, that's when you would get your seam guide and position it. If you notice, I have this machine which doesn't have this foot, sorry, on my machine that doesn't have a guide on the edge, so that's why I find these really useful. So if I stick that on there, then I know that if I take my fabric again, I can butt it right up against that seam guide that I've now put on my machine. And that is now a scant 1/4", because it's just a slight bit within the edge of the ruler, and my stitching's still on that 1/4" line there. So I know that that's where that needs to be. These, I'm going to test taking it off the machine now. They stay stuck pretty well, so it takes a bit to peel that off there. Whereas with the purple ones, it actually comes all the way out. It covers where I'd need to take off the plate for cleaning, but that's the same with both of these on my machine. But also, it also goes into where my extension table is, which is another reason why I end up cutting off these edges, because these are the ones that if I'm moving this regularly, that's the part that gets worn. So these come off a lot easier in my opinion, and you can just stick them back on the sheet for later. And these are made by C&T Publishing, and they are quite a bit more expensive. I think they're about twice the price of these ones, but it depends on how long this lasts for. I've not tried it out long enough yet. These feel like they're slightly higher as well. This This claims to be a 32nd of an inch tall, so that's the edge there. This, kind of up against it, does feel very comparable, kind of the same kind of height across the two. But because this is made of a softer material, maybe that's why it feels like it's not quite as high as the plastic ones. But I'm going to give this one a go, and we'll see if I like them as much as these. So here we are a week on. I've still got this seam guide stuck to my machine. That's the yellow ones, the cheaper ones, the ones that are called guidelines for quilting. And even though it's paper, it is actually sticking really well. There's no shifting at all. There's a few kind of foldy lines from when I was pulling it off and putting it back on the machine again, but that doesn't seem to have kind of affected its stickiness. So actually, I think it might be better value than the purple ones, because these ones were, I think, around $6 or $7, whereas the plastic ones were around 15. So you're talking at least half the price, and they hold in place really well. They're not quite as long, but I don't really need them to be, and it means I can take my table on and off without this extending over the edge of the table. I will obviously need to replace them eventually, because I guess they will start to wander, but they actually hold themselves in place better than the purple ones after they've been taken on and off a few times. So I'm pretty pleased with those actually, even though I thought it would be quite flimsy. It might actually work out to be the best value for money.